In the sweltering heat of a Louisiana summer in 1849, a young enslaved boy woke screaming in the night. His trembling hands clutched the rough cotton blanket as sweat poured down his face. He had seen something impossible, something that would change everything by morning. His master, Edward Whitmore, lying motionless in the study, blood pooling beneath the mahogany desk. The dream felt too real, too vivid. But dreams were just dreams, weren't they? By sunrise, the entire plantation would learn the terrifying truth. What the boy saw in his sleep had already begun to unfold in the waking world. The air hung thick and oppressive over Whitmore Plantation, a sprawling estate nestled along the Mississippi River, where cotton fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The mansion stood proud and white against the darkening sky, its columns gleaming in the fading light of day. Inside the slave quarters, a collection of weathered wooden cabins lined the dirt path leading away from the main house. Smoke rose from chimneys as families prepared their meager evening meals. 12-year-old Samuel lived in the third cabin with his mother, Ruth, and his younger sister, Clara. Ruth worked in the big house as a cook, her skilled hands preparing elaborate meals for the Whitmore family, while her own children survived on cornmeal and scraps. Samuel worked in the stables, tending to the horses that Master Whitmore prized above most things. The boy had learned early to move quietly, speak softly, and never draw attention to himself. Survival depended on invisibility. That particular evening felt different somehow. The atmosphere carried an electric quality that Samuel couldn't name. He helped his mother carry water from the well, noticing how the cicadas seemed louder than usual, their chorus almost deafening in the humid air. The sky had turned a peculiar shade of orange, and storm clouds gathered in the distance, promising rain that wouldn't come. After supper, Samuel lay on his pallet, listening to Clara's soft breathing beside him. His mother hummed an old spiritual as she mended a torn shirt by candlelight. The familiar routine should have comforted him, but restlessness churned in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that something approached, something dark and inevitable. Sleep came eventually, dragging him down into depths he hadn't anticipated. The dream began innocently enough. He walked through the main house, his bare feet silent on the polished wooden floors. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the hallway. He moved toward Master Whitmore's study, though he had no reason to be there, no permission to enter that sacred space. The door stood ajar. Samuel pushed it open, and the scene before him froze his blood. Master Edward Whitmore lay sprawled across the floor, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood spread in a dark pool beneath his head, soaking into the expensive Turkish rug he had imported from New Orleans. The master's eyes stared at nothing, glassy and vacant. Papers scattered across the desk, and an overturned glass had spilled amber liquid across the mahogany surface. But what terrified Samuel most was the clarity. Every detail burned into his mind with perfect precision. The torn corner of a document near the master's hand, the way his pocket watch had fallen from his vest, its chain still attached, the distinctive pattern of the blood spreading like dark fingers across the floor, the smell of tobacco and whiskey mixing with something metallic and wrong. Samuel jerked awake, his scream tearing through the quiet cabin. Ruth rushed to his side, her strong hands gripping his shoulders as he thrashed against the blanket. Clara sat up, frightened by her brother's distress. The candle had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. "Hush now, child," Ruth whispered urgently, glancing toward the door. "You wake the whole quarters with that noise. What troubles you so?" Samuel couldn't speak at first. His throat felt tight, and tears streamed down his face. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he tell his mother that he had witnessed Master Whitmore's death in a dream so vivid? It felt like memory rather than imagination. "Just a nightmare, Mama," he finally managed, his voice barely audible. "Just a bad dream." But Ruth knew her son. She saw the terror in his eyes, the way his whole body trembled. This was no ordinary childhood fear. Something had shaken him to his core. She pulled him close, rocking him gently as she had when he was smaller, humming that same spiritual until his breathing slowed and his muscles relaxed. Samuel didn't sleep again that night. He lay awake, watching the darkness gradually surrender to dawn, wondering if he had truly seen the future or if his mind had simply conjured horrors from the daily fears that plagued every enslaved person. Either way, morning would bring answers he wasn't sure he wanted. The roosters began their chorus before sunrise, their calls echoing across the plantation grounds. Samuel rose with heavy limbs, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. Ruth watched him carefully as she prepared breakfast, her concern evident in the tight set of her jaw. She said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Years of enslavement had taught her when to ask questions and when to simply observe. Samuel dressed quickly in his worn work clothes and stepped outside into the humid morning air. The sky had turned a pale grey, and mist rose from the ground like spirits ascending. He made his way toward the stables, his feet following the familiar path automatically, while his mind remained trapped in the nightmare's grip. The stablemaster, an older enslaved man named Moses, was already mucking out the stalls when Samuel arrived. Moses had worked with horses for 40 years, his weathered hands skilled and gentle despite the hard labor. He looked up as Samuel entered, noting immediately that something troubled the boy. "You look like death warmed over," Moses observed, leaning on his pitchfork. "Didn't sleep?" Samuel shook his head, grabbing a bucket to begin his morning chores. He couldn't meet Moses's eyes, afraid that the old man would see too much, would somehow know about the dream. Instead, he focused on filling the water troughs, checking the horses, distributing feed with mechanical precision. The plantation came alive gradually. Enslaved workers emerged from their cabins, heading to their assigned tasks in the fields, the big house, the kitchen, the laundry. Overseers shouted orders, their voices harsh in the morning stillness. The rhythms of another day under bondage began their familiar, relentless beat. Samuel had just finished brushing down Master Whitmore's favorite stallion when he heard the commotion. Voices rose from the direction of the main house, sharp and urgent. He froze, the brush falling from his hand. Moses stopped working too, both of them listening intently. A woman screamed. The sound cut through the morning air like a knife, followed by shouting and the thunder of footsteps on the mansion's front porch. Samuel's heart began to race, pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He knew. Somehow, he already knew what had happened. "Stay here," Moses commanded, but Samuel couldn't obey. His feet carried him toward the big house as if pulled by invisible strings. He needed to see, needed to confirm whether his dream had been prophecy or madness. The scene unfolded before him like a terrible play. Mrs. Whitmore stood on the veranda in her nightgown, her face pale as death itself, supported by 2 house servants. The overseer, Thomas Crawford, burst through the front door, his expression grim. Other white men from neighboring properties began arriving on horseback, summoned by slaves sent running with the news. Samuel crept closer, hiding behind the massive oak tree that dominated the front yard. His mother emerged from the kitchen entrance, confusion and fear written across her features. The head house servant, an older woman named Beatrice, spoke in hushed, frantic tones to the gathering crowd of enslaved workers. "Master Whitmore's dead," she whispered, her voice carrying just far enough for Samuel to hear. "Found him in his study this morning. Blood everywhere. Lord have mercy, blood everywhere." The words confirmed what Samuel's soul already knew. His dream had been real. Somehow, impossibly, he had seen Edward Whitmore's death before it happened. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he had to grip the tree trunk to keep from falling. The implications crashed over him in waves. If people learned about his dream, what would they think? In a time and place where enslaved people were already viewed with suspicion and fear, claiming to have foreseen a white man's death would be catastrophic. They would call him a witch, a devil worshipper. They might even accuse him of causing the death somehow, of using dark magic or conspiracy. Samuel watched as white men entered the house, emerging minutes later with grave expressions. The local doctor arrived, his black bag clutched tightly. The sheriff from the nearest town rode up on a gray mare, his badge glinting in the strengthening sunlight. The plantation had transformed into chaos, everyone moving with urgent purpose while trying to process the shocking news. Ruth found Samuel behind the oak tree, her face tight with worry. She pulled him close without speaking, and in that embrace, Samuel felt her fear. She knew something troubled him deeply, something connected to this tragedy. Mothers always knew. "Did you see something, child?" she whispered against his hair, so softly that no one else could possibly hear. "In your dream last night?" Samuel nodded, unable to speak. Ruth's arms tightened around him, and he felt her body stiffen with terror. She understood the danger immediately, understood what such knowledge could mean for her son. "You tell nobody," she hissed urgently. "You hear me, Samuel? Not a living soul, not Moses, not Clara, not your closest friend. This stays between us and the Lord above, you understand?" "Yes, Mama," Samuel managed, his voice cracking. "Whatever you saw, however you saw it, don't matter now. It's done. Master Whitmore's gone, and we got to worry about what comes next. New master, new rules, new dangers. We survive by staying quiet and invisible. Always have, always will." She was right. Samuel knew. Survival meant silence. It meant carrying this terrible knowledge alone, locked away in the deepest parts of his heart, where no one could find it. The investigation began immediately, transforming Whitmore Plantation into a scene of intense scrutiny. Sheriff William Harper, a tall man with steel-grey hair and cold blue eyes, questioned everyone who had been near the main house. His deputies searched the grounds looking for evidence, for weapons, for anything that might explain Edward Whitmore's violent death. The official story emerged slowly, pieced together from physical evidence and testimony. Master Whitmore had apparently been working late in his study, drinking whiskey and reviewing plantation accounts. Sometime during the night, he had fallen, striking his head on the corner of his desk with fatal force. A tragic accident, the doctor declared, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. The angle of the wound, the amount of blood, the position of the body, something didn't quite align with a simple fall. But accidents were easier to accept than alternatives. Murder raised questions that no one wanted to answer. Who would kill Edward Whitmore? Why? How had they entered and exited the study without being seen? The house servants swore they had heard nothing unusual. The dogs hadn't barked. The doors remained locked from the inside. Samuel listened to these discussions from his position in the stables, where white men gathered to smoke and talk freely, assuming the enslaved boy nearby was deaf to their conversations or too simple to understand. He learned that Master Whitmore had been in significant debt, that he owed money to banks in New Orleans and planters across Louisiana. He learned that the plantation's cotton yields had declined over the past 2 years, that Whitmore had been making enemies among his peers. He also learned that he wasn't the only one who found the official explanation insufficient. Thomas Crawford, the overseer, insisted something more sinister had occurred. He pushed for a thorough investigation, demanding that the sheriff question the enslaved population more aggressively. Some of the field workers, he suggested, might have harbored grudges. Perhaps one of them had found access to the study, had struck the master down in a moment of rage. The accusation sent waves of fear through the slave quarters. Everyone knew what happened when white men started looking for black culprits. Evidence mattered less than convenience. Someone would be blamed guilty or not, and the punishment would be swift and brutal. Families huddled together in their cabins at night, praying that suspicion wouldn't fall on their loved ones. Samuel carried his secret knowledge like a weight around his neck. He knew exactly how Master Whitmore had looked in death, because he had seen it before it happened, but he couldn't explain how or why. Had his dream been a vision sent by God? A curse? Simple coincidence. The questions tormented him during the day and haunted his attempts to sleep at night. 3 days after the death, Edward Whitmore's brother arrived from Baton Rouge. Jonathan Whitmore was younger by 5 years, a lawyer with political ambitions and a reputation for ruthlessness. He swept into the plantation like a storm, immediately taking control of the estate and announcing his intention to manage the property until matters could be properly settled. Jonathan brought changes with him. He dismissed Thomas Crawford, replacing him with a harder overseer named Silas Blackwood, a man known throughout Louisiana for his cruelty. Work hours extended, rations decreased, punishments became more frequent and severe. The relative stability of Edward Whitmore's rule gave way to something darker and more oppressive. Samuel watched these transformations with growing dread. His dream had shown him death, but it hadn't warned him about what would follow. The plantation descended into a harsher reality, and he felt responsible somehow, as if by seeing the future he had helped create it. Ruth worked longer hours in the kitchen, preparing meals for Jonathan and his frequent visitors. She came home exhausted each night, her hands raw from constant labor. Clara developed a cough that wouldn't go away, the result of sleeping in a cabin that leaked when it rained. Moses aged visibly, his body struggling under the increased demands of the new regime. One evening, as Samuel sat outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of red and gold, Moses approached and settled beside him on the wooden step. The old man's presence was comforting, solid and reliable in a world that felt increasingly unstable. "You've been carrying something heavy," Moses observed quietly. "Can see it in the way you move, the way you look at nothing like you seeing ghosts." Samuel said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. "I've been alive a long time," Moses continued, his voice low and gentle. "Seen things that don't make sense, things that can't be explained by what we know of the world. My grandmother, she had the sight, could see things before they happened, feel when death was coming. Scared her sometimes, that knowledge, made her feel alone." Samuel's breath caught. Was Moses suggesting what he thought? Did the old man suspect? "If a person was to have such a gift," Moses said carefully, "best thing they could do is stay quiet about it. People fear what they don't understand, and fear makes them cruel. White folks especially can't abide the idea that a slave might know things they don't, might see truths hidden from them." "How does someone live with it?" Samuel whispered. "Knowing things but being powerless to change them?" Moses was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Same way we live with everything else in this life, one day at a time, finding small moments of grace where we can, protecting the people we love, and trusting that someday, somehow things will be different." The old man stood slowly, his joints creaking, and placed a weathered hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Whatever you've seen, whatever you know, it don't define you. You're more than that gift or curse or whatever it is. You're a boy who loves his mama and his sister, who treats horses with kindness, who got a good heart. Don't let fear steal that from you." Moses walked away, leaving Samuel alone with the fading light. 2 weeks after Edward Whitmore's death, strange occurrences began plaguing the plantation. Tools disappeared from the workshop, only to reappear in impossible locations. Horses became skittish without apparent cause, refusing to enter certain areas of the stable. House servants reported hearing footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing when no one was near. The white population began whispering about ghosts, about Edward Whitmore's restless spirit walking the grounds. Mrs. Whitmore, now living in the guest wing under her brother-in-law's grudging hospitality, claimed she heard her husband's voice calling her name at night. The superstitious among the plantation workers made signs against evil and avoided the main house after dark. Samuel knew the truth was far more mundane. The missing tools were taken by desperate people trying to barter for food or medicine. The horses sensed the tension that permeated the plantation, responding to the fear and anger that hung in the air like smoke. The footsteps and doors were the natural sounds of an old house settling, amplified by grief and imagination. But he also experienced something he couldn't explain so easily. The dreams continued, not every night, but often enough to establish a pattern. He would see events before they occurred: a field worker breaking his leg when a plow horse spooked, a kitchen fire that would destroy 3 months of preserved food, a violent storm that would damage the cotton crop. Each vision proved accurate. Each prediction came true. Samuel began to dread sleep. He would lie awake as long as possible, fighting exhaustion until his body simply surrendered. Ruth noticed his deteriorating condition, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he jumped at sudden sounds. She tried to comfort him, but what solace could she offer? They both understood the impossible situation. He possessed knowledge that could help people, but revealing that knowledge would destroy him. The burden grew heavier when Samuel dreamed of Clara. He saw his sister lying in their cabin, her small body racked with fever, her breathing shallow and labored. In the dream, Ruth knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face, helpless to save her child. Samuel woke, gasping, his heart racing with terror. He immediately checked on Clara, finding her asleep and apparently healthy. But the cough had persisted, and she seemed thinner than before, her appetite poor. The dream felt like a warning, a chance to prevent tragedy rather than simply witness it. But what could he do? Enslaved people had no access to doctors, no money for medicine. They relied on folk remedies and prayer, hoping that minor illnesses would pass without becoming serious. Clara's condition wasn't yet critical enough to draw attention, and even if it were, Jonathan Whitmore had shown little interest in the welfare of his human property, beyond their ability to work. Samuel struggled with his helplessness. What good was seeing the future if he couldn't change it? The knowledge tortured him, offering glimpses of what could be while denying him the power to alter outcomes. He felt like a puppet forced to watch his own strings being pulled, aware of the performance but unable to improvise. One morning, while working in the stables, Samuel overheard a conversation that shifted his perspective. Two white men from town sat on the fence, discussing Edward Whitmore's death with Sheriff Harper, who had returned to ask additional questions. "The wife's convinced it wasn't an accident," one man said, lighting a cigar. "Says Edward had enemies, people who wanted him dead." "Mrs. Whitmore's grief-stricken," the sheriff replied dismissively. "Women get ideas when they're emotional. The evidence points to a tragic fall, nothing more sinister." "What about the financial irregularities?" the other man pressed. "I heard Edward owed significant sums to some dangerous people in New Orleans. Gambling debts, failed investments. Maybe someone came collecting." Sheriff Harper shifted uncomfortably. "We found no evidence of forced entry, no signs of struggle beyond the fall itself. Unless you're suggesting one of the slaves—" "I'm suggesting you look beyond the obvious," the first man interrupted. "Edward Whitmore didn't strike me as clumsy or careless. The man survived the Mexican War, ran a plantation for 20 years, then suddenly he trips and cracks his skull open. Convenient timing, don't you think, right when his debts were coming due?" The conversation continued, but Samuel had heard enough. The pieces began connecting in his mind. If Master Whitmore's death wasn't an accident, if someone had deliberately killed him, then his dream had shown him not just death but murder. And if the authorities were asking the wrong questions, looking in the wrong places, then the real killer remained free. This realization brought new terror. Samuel possessed information about a crime, witnessed through impossible means. He knew details that could help solve the mystery, the exact position of the body, the pattern of blood, the scattered papers. But offering that information would require explaining how he knew it, which would lead to questions he couldn't answer without revealing his visions. He was trapped between silence and exposure, between protecting himself and pursuing justice. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on him, making it difficult to breathe, to think, to function. He moved through his days in a fog, performing tasks automatically, while his mind churned with impossible dilemmas. Ruth found him sitting alone behind the stables one evening, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She sat beside him without speaking, her presence a comfort even when words failed. After a long silence, Samuel finally spoke. "What if you could stop something bad from happening, but doing so would put you in terrible danger? What would you do?" Ruth considered carefully before answering. "Depends on how bad the thing is and who it would hurt. If it's about saving someone you love, sometimes the risk is worth it. But if it's about justice for someone who never showed us mercy, who kept us in chains and treated us like property, then maybe staying safe matters more. But what if letting it go means other people suffer? What if the wrong person gets blamed? Child, we live in a world where wrong people get blamed every day, where innocent folks suffer for crimes they didn't commit, just because of the color of their skin. You can't fix all that wrong. You can only protect the people close to you and survive to see another day." Her words made sense, but they didn't ease Samuel's conscience. He knew she was right about the dangers, about the futility of seeking justice in a system designed to deny it to people like them. But knowing didn't stop him from wanting to do something, anything, to make sense of the terrible gift he'd been given. The plantation descended further into chaos as Jonathan Whitmore's true nature revealed itself. He sold off pieces of furniture, paintings, and silverware from the main house, claiming he needed to settle his brother's debts. But the enslaved workers whispered that the money went into Jonathan's own pockets, funding his political aspirations and lavish lifestyle in Baton Rouge. Silas Blackwood, the new overseer, ruled with an iron fist and a whip that he used liberally. Field workers returned to their cabins each evening with fresh wounds, their backs striped with bloody welts. The cotton harvest suffered, despite the increased brutality, or perhaps because of it. Exhausted, frightened people made mistakes, worked slower, found small ways to resist without openly rebelling. Samuel's dreams grew more frequent and more disturbing. He saw Blackwood beating an elderly field worker nearly to death over a perceived slight. He saw Jonathan Whitmore signing papers that would separate families, selling children away from their mothers to raise quick cash. He saw the plantation crumbling under mismanagement and cruelty, the fields going fallow, the buildings falling into disrepair. Each vision came true with horrifying accuracy. The elderly worker, a man named Josiah, was whipped so severely that he couldn't walk for a week. 3 children were indeed sold to a trader passing through, their mothers' screams echoing across the plantation as they were dragged away in chains. The neglect became visible in overgrown paths and broken fences. Clara's condition worsened, just as Samuel had foreseen. The cough that had seemed manageable transformed into something more serious. She developed a fever that came and went, leaving her weak and confused. Ruth tried every remedy she knew, teas made from herbs gathered in the woods, poultices applied to Clara's chest, prayers whispered over her small body in the darkness. Nothing helped. Samuel watched his sister deteriorate, powerless to stop what he had already seen in his dreams. The knowledge that she might die tortured him in ways that no physical punishment could match. He had been given the ability to see the future, but not the power to change it. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. Moses found Samuel in the stables one afternoon, sitting in an empty stall with tears streaming down his face. The old man lowered himself carefully to the hay-covered floor, his joints protesting the movement. "Your sister's getting worse," Moses said gently. It wasn't a question. Samuel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Sometimes seeing don't mean we can change what's coming," Moses continued. "Sometimes all we can do is prepare ourselves, make peace with what we can't control. That don't make the gift less valuable, just makes it a different kind of blessing." "It doesn't feel like a blessing," Samuel managed. "It feels like a curse. Why would God show me these things if I can't do anything about them? Maybe it ain't about doing. Maybe it's about bearing witness. Someone needs to remember what happens here, needs to hold the truth of our suffering and our strength. Maybe that someone is you." The words offered little comfort, but Samuel understood what Moses meant. In a world where enslaved people's lives and deaths went unrecorded, where their stories disappeared like smoke, perhaps witnessing mattered. Perhaps remembering was its own form of resistance. That night, as Clara's fever spiked dangerously high, Ruth made a desperate decision. She went to the main house and begged Jonathan Whitmore for help, pleading for access to a doctor or medicine. Samuel watched from the shadows as his mother, proud and strong, humbled herself before a man who viewed her as property. Jonathan stood on the veranda, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and looked down at Ruth with cold indifference. "The girl's just a child slave," he said dismissively. "Probably worth less than the cost of a doctor's visit. If she dies, she dies. I'll adjust the property records accordingly." Ruth's face remained carefully blank, but Samuel saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. She nodded once and walked away with her dignity intact. Though something inside her had broken, Samuel felt it too, that moment when hope died and was replaced by hard, cold determination. Things couldn't continue this way. The plantation was destroying them slowly, grinding them down day by day. Samuel's visions had shown him darkness and suffering, but surely they couldn't represent the only possible future. Surely there had to be another path, another way forward that he simply hadn't seen yet. He decided that night to stop being passive, to stop simply accepting what his dreams showed him. If he couldn't change the future, perhaps he could at least try to understand it better, to look for opportunities hidden within the visions. Knowledge was power, even for a 12-year-old enslaved boy with no apparent agency. The question was how to use that knowledge without exposing himself to deadly consequences. Clara's fever broke 3 days later, but she remained weak and fragile. Ruth barely left her side, neglecting her duties in the big house kitchen. This drew Silas Blackwood's attention and his anger. He appeared at their cabin one morning, whip in hand. demanding that Ruth return to work immediately or face punishment. Samuel watched from the doorway as his mother stood between the overseer and her sick daughter, her face set with quiet defiance. She had reached a breaking point where fear no longer controlled her actions. If protecting Clara meant accepting a beating, she would accept it gladly. "That child's still fevered," Ruth said calmly. "She needs tending. I'll return to the kitchen when she's stable." Blackwood's face reddened with rage. No enslaved woman spoke to him that way, challenged his authority so directly. He raised the whip, and Samuel moved without thinking, placing himself in front of his mother. The boy's courage surprised everyone, including himself. "Please, sir," Samuel said, keeping his eyes lowered respectfully. "My mamma's the best cook on this plantation. If she's worried and distracted, the food won't be fit for Master Whitmore. Let her tend my sister today, and I'll work double tomorrow. I'll do her chores and mine both." The logic appealed to Blackwood's practical nature. Jonathan Whitmore had complained about the declining quality of meals since Ruth's distraction began. Having her return focused and capable made more sense than beating her into resentful compliance. "One day," Blackwood growled, "then she's back in that kitchen, sick child or not. And you'll keep your promise about double work, boy, or I'll stripe your back until the flesh hangs in ribbons." He left, and Ruth pulled Samuel into a fierce embrace. "You foolish, brave child," she whispered. "Don't you ever step in front of that whip again, you hear me? I can't lose you too." But something had shifted in Samuel. The passive acceptance that had characterized his response to the visions had transformed into active determination. He couldn't change what he saw in his dreams, but he could navigate around the edges of fate, find small ways to alter outcomes or mitigate suffering. That afternoon, while working in the stables, Samuel had another vision. This one was different, sharper, and more immediate than the others. He saw Moses lying in the barn, blood flowing from a wound in his side. Standing over him was Thomas Crawford, the former overseer. His face twisted with rage and madness. Crawford held a knife, and his words echoed in Samuel's mind. "You told them about the money. You got me dismissed." The vision snapped off abruptly, leaving Samuel gasping and disoriented. He had seen murder before it happened, witnessed the moment of violence that would claim Moses's life. But unlike his previous visions, this one felt different. It hadn't happened yet. There was still time to prevent it. Samuel struggled with what to do. If he warned Moses, how would he explain his knowledge? If he went to the authorities, they wouldn't believe him. But if he stayed silent, the old man who had shown him such kindness would die. He decided to start with observation. That evening, he positioned himself where he could watch the stable area without being obvious. Hours passed. Most of the plantation settled into sleep. Samuel fought exhaustion, knowing that giving in to rest might mean missing the crucial moment. Near midnight, a figure approached the barn. Even in darkness, Samuel recognized Thomas Crawford's distinctive walk. The former overseer had been drinking. His movements were unsteady but purposeful. He carried something in his right hand that glinted in the moonlight. A knife. Samuel's heart raced. The vision was about to come true. He had minutes, maybe seconds, to act. But what could a 12-year-old enslaved boy do against a grown white man armed with a weapon? Confronting Crawford directly would likely result in his own death. Instead, Samuel did something unexpected. He began singing, his voice carrying across the quiet plantation grounds. It was a spiritual his mother had taught him, a song about deliverance and salvation. The melody was beautiful and haunting, impossible to ignore. Lights appeared in cabin windows as people woke to investigate the source of the singing. Moses emerged from the barn, confused by the nighttime serenade. Crawford froze in the shadows, his opportunity for secret violence evaporating as witnesses gathered. "Boy, what in blazes are you doing?" Moses called out, approaching Samuel with concern. "You gone mad?" Samuel kept singing, watching Crawford retreat into the darkness, his plan foiled by unexpected attention. The former overseer disappeared into the night, and Samuel finally let the song fade away. "Had a feeling," Samuel said simply when Moses reached him. "Just had a feeling you needed to hear that song tonight." Moses studied the boy's face in the dim light, seeing something there that made him nod slowly in understanding. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For whatever reason you felt that need, thank you." Samuel had changed the future. He had seen death coming and prevented it through indirect action that didn't expose his gift. The realization filled him with hope. Perhaps his visions weren't just prophecies of inevitable doom. Perhaps they were warnings, opportunities to alter outcomes through careful intervention. News of Thomas Crawford's nighttime visit spread quickly through the slave quarters, though few understood its full significance. Samuel kept the details of his vision private, but his timely intervention had saved Moses' life and prevented a murder that would have brought even more chaos to the plantation. Jonathan Whitmore, hearing about Crawford lurking around the property, had the sheriff investigate. They discovered that the former overseer had been stealing from Edward Whitmore for years, skimming money from cotton sales and falsifying records. When Jonathan started reviewing the plantation books, Crawford feared exposure and blamed Moses for reporting the theft. The murder attempt had been revenge and self-preservation combined. Crawford was arrested, providing Samuel with an unexpected revelation. His vision of Edward Whitmore's death replayed in his mind with new understanding. The papers scattered across the desk, the overturned whiskey glass. What if those weren't signs of an accident? What if Crawford, desperate to hide his embezzlement, had confronted Edward that night? What if the master's death hadn't been an accident at all, but murder disguised to look like one? Samuel couldn't prove his theory, and even if he could, who would listen to an enslaved child's accusations? But the possibility haunted him. Perhaps his first vision had been trying to show him more than just death. Perhaps it had been revealing a crime that everyone else had accepted as accident. The arrest changed conditions on the plantation somewhat. With Crawford's theft exposed, Jonathan Whitmore had to acknowledge that his brother's financial problems stemmed partly from employee dishonesty rather than just poor management. Some of the pressure eased. Blackwood remained harsh, but Jonathan began spending more time in Baton Rouge, leaving day-to-day operations to others. Clara recovered slowly, her strength returning by degrees. Ruth went back to working in the kitchen, her gratitude toward Samuel evident in every glance, every gentle touch. The family had survived another crisis, though they all understood how precarious their existence remained. Samuel's dreams continued, but he approached them differently now. Instead of passive resignation, he studied each vision carefully, looking for details he could use, opportunities for intervention. Sometimes he could change outcomes through subtle actions, other times he could only prepare people emotionally for what was coming, offering comfort without revealing the source of his foreknowledge. Moses became his confidant, the one person who understood without needing explicit confirmation. The old man never asked directly about Samuel's gift, but he listened when the boy needed to talk, offered wisdom when questions arose, and created cover when Samuel needed to act on his visions. One evening, as they worked together in the stables, Moses spoke about the future in broader terms. "Things can't stay like this forever," he said quietly. "There's talk in the quarters, whispers coming up from New Orleans and down from the north. Talk about freedom, about change coming. Might not be in my lifetime, but maybe in yours." Samuel wanted to believe him, wanted to imagine a future where his visions showed joy and possibility instead of suffering and loss. But every dream still revealed a world of bondage and pain, suggesting that whatever change Moses predicted lay far beyond the horizon of Samuel's sight. "Do you think God gives some people the sight so they can prepare others?" Samuel asked. "So they can help people survive until that change comes?" "Could be," Moses replied thoughtfully. "Or maybe it's so someone remembers truly what happened, without the lies and forgetting that powerful people do. Truth has power, even when it can't be spoken out loud." Especially then. Their conversation was interrupted by shouting from the main house. Samuel and Moses exchanged concerned glances before moving carefully toward the commotion. They found Mrs. Whitmore on the veranda, arguing loudly with Jonathan. Her voice carried across the evening air, shrill with anger and desperation. "You're destroying everything Edward built," she cried, "selling off property, neglecting the fields, treating people with such cruelty that the work suffers. This plantation won't survive another year under your management." "This plantation is mine now," Jonathan shot back. "You have no say in how I run it. Be grateful I allow you to remain here at all." "I know what you did," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried even farther. "I know Edward didn't fall. I know someone killed him, and I know you benefited most from his death." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Jonathan's face went pale, then flushed with rage. He grabbed his sister-in-law's arm roughly, dragging her inside the house. The door slammed, cutting off whatever came next. Samuel's mind raced. Mrs. Whitmore suspected murder too. But was she accusing Jonathan himself, or simply noting his convenient inheritance? Either way, her words had exposed dangerous tensions that could explode into violence. That night, Samuel dreamed of the plantation burning. The vision of fire consumed Samuel's sleep for 3 consecutive nights. Each time the details remained consistent. Flames erupted from the main house in the early morning hours, spreading rapidly through the dry wooden structure. People ran in all directions, some trying to fight the blaze, others simply fleeing. In the chaos, he saw faces he recognized: his mother, Clara, Moses, other enslaved workers. But he also saw something else, a figure watching from the tree line, silhouetted against the orange glow, satisfaction evident in their posture. Samuel knew fires were common on plantations. Cooking accidents, lightning strikes, carelessly discarded tobacco, any number of innocent causes could spark disaster. But the figure in his vision suggested deliberate action. Someone planned to burn Whitmore Plantation, and they planned to do it soon. The question of why troubled him less than the question of when. His visions usually occurred shortly before the actual events, but the repetition suggested this fire lay further in the future, or that the danger was building toward an inevitable conclusion. He had time to act, but he didn't know how much. Samuel shared his concern with Moses, speaking carefully about having a bad feeling without revealing the specific nature of his dreams. The old man listened gravely, understanding more than what was said. "Fire's always a risk," Moses acknowledged. "But if you're feeling particularly worried, we should prepare. Make sure people know where the water barrels are, clear brush away from the cabins, check that escape routes ain't blocked. Can't prevent every disaster, but we can make surviving one more likely." They worked together over the following days, preparing without causing alarm. Samuel recruited Clara to help identify which families had small children who might need extra help evacuating. Ruth discreetly checked that the kitchen's fire precautions were adequate. Moses ensured the stables had clear paths to get the horses out quickly. 2 weeks after the first fire dream, Jonathan Whitmore announced he was returning to Baton Rouge for an extended stay. Business matters required his attention, he claimed, though everyone suspected he simply wanted to escape the increasingly hostile atmosphere. Mrs. Whitmore had made life difficult for him, constantly questioning his decisions and making accusations she couldn't prove. Silas Blackwood would manage the plantation in Jonathan's absence, with authority to make all necessary decisions. This news settled over the enslaved population like a heavy blanket. Blackwood's cruelty had limits only when Jonathan was present. Without that minimal restraint, conditions would deteriorate further. The night after Jonathan's departure, Samuel had a different dream. He saw Mrs. Whitmore in the main house, holding a lamp, her face illuminated by its flickering light. She moved through the rooms with purpose, touching furniture, looking at paintings, saying goodbye to a life that was ending. Then she descended to the study where her husband had died, and she set the lamp down on the desk. The flame touched papers and fire began to spread. Samuel woke with certainty. Mrs. Whitmore planned to burn the plantation. Whether from grief, revenge, or desperate insurance fraud, she intended to destroy everything. And in his vision, the fire spread beyond the main house to the slave quarters where his family slept. He faced an impossible moral dilemma. Mrs. Whitmore had never been kind to the enslaved workers, but she hadn't been particularly cruel either. She existed in their lives as a distant figure of authority, neither friend nor enemy. Her loss of husband and home had earned her some sympathy, even among people who had no reason to care about white folks' suffering. But her grief-driven plan for arson would kill innocent people. The fire wouldn't discriminate between the objects of her revenge and the human beings who had no part in her suffering. Samuel's family and everyone he cared about faced death because a white woman couldn't bear her loss. He couldn't let it happen. But warning people directly would require explaining his knowledge, exposing his gift. The consequences would be devastating. Accusations of witchcraft, suspicions of conspiracy, punishment for a 12-year-old child who dared to claim he could see the future. Samuel spent the entire next day wrestling with his options. By evening, he had formed a plan. It was risky and required perfect timing, but it might work without exposing himself. That night, he snuck out of the cabin after everyone slept. The plantation lay quiet under a half-moon, shadows deep and concealing. Samuel made his way to the main house, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. He had never deliberately entered the master's house uninvited. The transgression terrified him, but Liv's depended on his courage. He found a window that opened onto the study, the same room where Edward Whitmore had died, where Samuel had seen the body in his first vision. The window's latch was old and loose. He worked it carefully, wincing at every small sound. Inside, the study looked exactly as he had seen it in his dreams. The mahogany desk stood in the same position. The Turkish rug still bore a faint stain where blood had soaked in. Samuel moved quickly to the desk and began disturbing papers, making it look like someone had been searching through documents. Then he took the lamp oil and carefully poured it in places where fire would spread quickly if ignited, near curtains, on furniture, across the floor. If Mrs. Whitmore came here intending to start a fire, she would find evidence of someone else's recent visit. The discovery might alarm her enough to abandon her plan, or at least delay it while she investigated. Either way, Samuel was buying time and creating doubt. He slipped back out the window and returned to the cabin, his entire body shaking with fear and adrenaline. What he had done could get him killed if discovered, but if it prevented the fire he had seen in his visions, the risk was worthwhile. Morning came, and Samuel waited anxiously for some reaction. None came immediately. The plantation woke and worked through another difficult day. But as evening approached, he saw Mrs. Whitmore emerge from the main house with a carpet bag, her face set with determination. A carriage arrived, and she departed without explanation, leaving Silas Blackwood confused and the household staff uncertain. Samuel never learned exactly what Mrs. Whitmore had found in the study or what conclusions she had drawn. But she left Whitmore Plantation that evening and never returned. The fire he had seen in his vision never occurred. He had changed the future again, this time preventing disaster through bold action that risked everything. Samuel understood now what his gift truly meant. The visions weren't fixed prophecies but warnings, opportunities to alter outcomes for those willing to act despite the risks. He had been given not just sight but responsibility, and he would carry that burden with the same courage that had brought him this far. The journey ahead remained uncertain, but Samuel faced it with new understanding. He would bear witness, prepare people when he could, intervene when necessary, and survive until the world changed enough for his story to be told openly. That was his purpose, his destiny, his reason for seeing what others could not. The boy who saw his master's death in a dream had become someone far more significant, a keeper of truths, a subtle force for survival, a witness to history in the making. And though his gift brought pain and responsibility, it also brought power he was only beginning to understand. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.